I listen to classical music and a lot of rock music. And I also listen to jazz, but only because my dad was playing jazz piano in the living room. So at that time, I'm now extremely interested in and indebted to the jazz legacy um, in a sort of side career as a jazz pianist. But at the time, I was not really interested in jazz in large measure because that was Dad's music. So I had to sort of find my own. And so my own music increasingly became rock music. I loved the Beatles. I loved Led Zeppelin. I loved Queen. I loved Van Halen. A lot of rock and pop. So I mean, I was born in 1967, and I grew up listening to obviously 1970s and 80s music, you know, and so a lot of pop music of the time was interesting to me. It was in the air. I think I was rather ecumenical and omnivorous in my tastes, so I didn't belong to a particular subgenre. And then eventually I started playing in a rock band in high school. I started playing synthesizer keyboards, and that was a lot of fun. I thought that was a musical construction, but it turned out it was really a social construction. It was really about trying to find a social space, a place to belong, and to have friends, classmates with whom I could engage in some sort of, you know, meaningful enterprise. And then with the backdrop of like just being terrified that I was going to die a virgin. So I think I thought I was doing music, but it was really more about like self-loathing and loneliness and things like that. I'm only trained on the piano, and you know, I studied classical piano as a kid. Um, I then migrated to playing piano in more of a jazz idiom and in some sort of like contemporary improvisational idioms. I play guitar. Um, I'm a mediocre guitarist and electric bass player and drummer and percussionist. I I think that really my second instrument, though, after the piano, are these sound sculptures that I invent. These are original instruments made of junk and hardware and found objects mounted on electroacoustic soundboards, and I played them with my hands and with chopsticks and violin bows and wind-up toys and plectra and things like that. And so those instruments have really become sort of second only to the piano. And what's exciting for me in the pairing of the piano and these original electroacoustic sound sculptures is that they represent two kinds of poles of sorts, two almost antithetical cultural spaces. One being a traditional kind of conventional tool for which I'm one of millions of practitioners, and the other for which I'm simultaneously the world's greatest and worst player, because it's a sort of a prototype. There's only one of these instruments that I invent. And so it's exciting and daunting to confront the joys, the opportunities, but also the perils and the pitfalls of operating in a culture of one. So having the piano and these original instruments together as part of my, I don't know, artistic cosmology feels like a balanced pair of food groups of sorts. There's a photograph of me as like maybe an 8-year-old or something sitting at the kitchen table, and I'm writing music, but I don't have a memory of that. My first memory of writing music, in a sense, was maybe being in, I don't know, like 12 or something, and then just making up improvisations at the piano. Then in high school, writing pieces on the piano and songs, and composing a musical my senior year of high school. At that time, I was more connected socially to the theater scene of my high school than necessarily to a music one. So there was a kind of pivot. But it was really only in college that I started to compose music kind of in a deliberate, assiduous, sort of attentive manner. And I didn't conceive of myself as a, quote, career composer at all at the time. I was totally committed to this liberal arts vision of an undergraduate academic experience for which music was just part of it. But the music part, and especially within music, the composition part became so engrossing that by and by I identified sufficiently with the name composer to apply to graduate studies in composition. I think back to some moments in my childhood that may serve as antecedents to the kind of operations that I undertake as a composer today. And these are largely related to assuaging curiosities. Zooming ahead to the present, I think of each piece of music as an answer to a question. What if, ellipses, and then there's various versions of how we end the sentence of that question. So for me, it's all about experimenting through music, investigating, and those investigations, those experiments, are the consequence of some sort of weird obsession, of some curiosity, almost a fetishistic resonance with wondering about something, and whether that's a sound or some other kind of idea. And that's how I think of the pieces that I make today. But as a kid, I was abundantly curious about the world in all sorts of ways. And so I remember like being in Gerald Sherman's basement in 3rd grade and just like tearing apart like discarded like electronic appliances and things like that, and scavenging them for parts and then like reconfiguring them and hooking them up so that they would like turn lights on or make sounds, and then building. So there's a lot of building things, like wondering about things, taking them apart and building things with some of my friends. A lot of game playing, I think, is part of it. In junior high, then I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and that was, I loved to make mazes as a kid. So some of these things, I mean, in some ways I'm still making mazes or labyrinths for colleague performers today. And I think I can look back to those moments. And also watching, my father was always composing music when I was a kid. But in many respects, it was the compositions that my mother made that were not in the musical dimension, but were projects that were like sewing and needlepoint projects or cooking projects and all sorts of things like that. And so she had a sense of adventurousness that I think I've definitely inherited. The other enormously impacting influence was my uncle, Terry Applebaum, who's a percussionist and was the percussion pedagogue at neighboring Northwestern University when I grew up. And so from the very early age, I don't know, I remember being at his concerts from the age of about 7 or so. My dad would take me, and I would hear the craziest, weirdest percussion ensemble music. I remember hearing Varèse's Ionization as a kid, and Stockhausen pieces, and all sorts of John Cage works and so forth. And I have 2 memories that I can't reconcile in my mind. One is, as a kid, being utterly fascinated by these things, but feeling that they were crazy. Like that my uncle is this very weird, idiosyncratic alchemist of a sort, and he was just tapped into these very weird ritual of contemporary music that was rather foreign to me. Probably less foreign to me than for most kids. I mean, I got to go regularly to these concerts, but it always seemed like, wow, Uncle Terry is onto this strange, strange stuff. And then working as a beginning graduate student at the University of California at San Diego, and writing a percussion ensemble piece, it was actually percussion plus strings, that was performed by a Northwestern University new music ensemble in the very hall that I used to go as a kid. And I remember sitting there and thinking, like, how did I get from point A of finding this music to be so weird and curious and outlandish, to point B, the present then, in which like I was actually one of the practitioners who was, you know, perpetrating these dastardly deeds of musical invention, you know. I should say one other thing, which is that my uncle introduced me to the music of Conlon Nancaro, and that became an important compass point. I mean, he just introduced me to Nancaro's music in passing when I was 9 or 10 years old, and I just remembered that. And so during my undergraduate studies for my sort of senior thesis project, you know, I was 20 years old, but I managed to, through the help of my advisor, Janine Wagar, and her friend, Charles Amerkanian, here in the Bay Area, they set it up so that I could go down to Mexico City and spend a week with Conlon Nancaro. And that was just, yeah, my head exploded. And Nancaro was so generous and so hospitable. But yeah, I trace that back to an esoteric family sharing of sorts. Maybe the first time I heard a string quartet was actually in recording, in recorded form, and it may very well have been that this Kronos Quartet recording on None Such, that I think it was None Such, that it was that had a Nancaro piece on it, and I think a glass piece, and there was the Australian Peter Sculthorpe and other works, and the Hendrix Purple Haze arrangement. Every one of those pieces just completely blew me away. I mean, I was just flabbergasted, and that was discovering that album changed my life. That was before I had committed to being a composer, but maybe related to the commitment that was soon forthcoming. It was before I had ever, it was before I met Kronos, but then soon crossed paths with them, and then many years later had the opportunity to work with them professionally, musically. So yeah, that's actually a kind of a seminal point in my listening and my awareness of the contemporary music scene, and really more important, what contemporary music is and can be. There's maybe two qualities that inclined them to invite me, or rather I should say that among the many qualities that I might have exhibited that they managed to overcome or ignore in order to invite me to write again for them, there are two things that I think they might identify as of having some sort of value. And so one of those things I think is the fact that we collaborated together on an earlier piece not long ago called Darmstadt Kindergarten, which was a short piece that Kronos commissioned for their children's concert. And it's a piece that is at once a very serious, rigorous, disciplined, gritty, adult project, and simultaneously totally whimsical, full of levity, somewhat a little bit of humor, certainly absurdity, and can immediately be apparent to children, or rather the child in all of us, the sort of like homo ludens that we are. So that, like, we were still like speaking to each other after that and smiling and having a good time, and so it seemed to be a felicitous collaboration. And so I think that's one of the reasons that maybe we had a short track record. There are probably some 50 for the future composers who are new to Kronos, and I know quite a few who are multi-time veterans in terms of collaboration with Kronos. I'm sort of in that middle point in the sense that we had this one very fruitful collaboration. And then I think the second quality is I think they know that my music is interested in all sorts of I don't know, odd, sometimes marginal, idiosyncratic, weird kinds of different sorts of approaches for whatever that means. So I think I'm this is completely speculative, but I'm surmising that they imagined that the Applebaum food group would be not a repetition of one of the other very valuable food groups that are part of the 50 roster. And so, which creates a little bit of a burden for me, because there's a part of me that wants to be traditional and conventional alongside the part of me that wants to be more experimental. So figuring out how to negotiate the breadth of my artistic agenda with the perceived, the inferred reason or the imagined piece that Kronos might want from me, you know, there's some navigation to be done there. And of course, all of this is really a fool's errand, because in the end, Kronos wants me to write what I want to write. And I can only end up writing what I want to write anyway. I think that in the world of music that there are some groups who might say, this is what we do, write us a piece like that. And then there's other groups who might say, this is what we do, this is what we've done, please, for heaven's sakes, let us do something different. The excitement for me about Kronos is, in my mind at least, I put them in the latter group. And I'm a composer who's especially excited to work with those kinds of artistic, those kinds of musicians who are just game for all sorts of new and different types of things. And so that's really gratifying, and a reason, among the many reasons that I was really thrilled to be able to work with Kronos. I think of a unit that has extraordinary chamber music chemistry. There's, with a quartet, and specifically a string quartet, and a string quartet that's been playing together for a little while, you have this like kind of telepathy of sorts, a sensitivity. So there emerges this really deft sensibility from the players. And so I think, and that's not something that is limited to the string quartet. This can be found in all sorts of ensemble configurations, smaller ones and bigger ones. But I think the quartet, to my mind, is like almost a kind of idealized, crystallized version of that sort of like group music making, in which individuals can emerge, but there's a kind of a collective brain. I can't compose a piece of music unless I'm sufficiently engaged with the idea behind it. And that idea is usually a kind of curiosity about which I'm obsessed, and that I keep returning to time and time again. So I get lots of ideas. I get ideas all the time. Most of them are probably bad, you know, or just like not productive or not sufficiently interesting. But then within that mountain of ideas, sometimes one will emerge, and then I say, hey, I could work on this, not just for a minute, not just for an hour, not for a month. I could actually spend a year working on this thing, and the work will actually result in an artifact. It's more about the process, but it also results in an artifact, which is a piece of music. So I've come to trust not just that the idea is worthwhile because I have this sufficiently resonant curiosity about it, but the converse, that if I don't feel and recognize that sufficient obsessive interest in an idea, then I know this is not an idea that's worth pursuing, or I'm not at the time yet in my life, this is not the moment to just completely obsess about this idea in the form of a piece of music. So the idea for this piece is in some ways a sort of meta idea. Knowing that, you know, the gift and burden of a 50 for the Future commission is that you recognize that you're going to be part of this kind of extraordinary cohort of pieces, and that you're thinking, I mean, and it's a bit of a grandiose, I mean, it's an egocentric and arguably narcissistic kind of enterprise, to compose any piece of music. But then those qualities get ratcheted up another notch for a 50 for the future kind of thing. In short, that can be paralyzing, this kind of a commission, and you can get masterpiece syndrome. So first, I have to get rid of the masterpiece syndrome inclination and just say, let's just try to write a good piece. Let's try to write a piece that not like a masterwork. Let's just try to write a decent piece and one that we're sufficiently connected to. And so the idea here, that meta idea, was in some ways to think about my past with the string quartet and Kronos Quartet and its past. So my past, I've written, a half a dozen string quartets. And so there's parts of this piece in which I'm actually, in a retrospective manner, it's not really a secret, but I wouldn't expect anybody even those who know those pieces, to hear it. But there are quotations embedded from past pieces. And I'm using not the beginning of the piece, but fairly early on in the piece, a kind of kaleidoscopic formal construction in which these things come back. And the actual construction is a formal scheme that I've not used since 1996. And it was part of my doctoral work at UC San Diego, a construction that I call a Janus construction. It's sort of this two-faced construction that involve what I think of as a monolith, a very kind of glacial, sort of quiet, more Spartan musical exposition, and then a kaleidoscope, which is this more mercurial, rhythmically complicated, rather frenetic musical rhetoric that with a lot of unpredictability, and invites more dissonance and more changes of timbre in the instrument and so forth. And so the kaleidoscoping scheme itself is from my past. So this was a chance to revisit, to have a long retrospective view, and autobiographical, if perhaps self-indulgently so. So I'm mining my past, and so in the sense the piece opens with the monolith, with this very sort of quiet setting, this kind of more sparse little pointillistic, not pointillistic, as points within an otherwise sort of deserted landscape that then suddenly shifts into this kaleidoscope. And that's the Janus idea, these two things. So that's the first two, a sense of 4 continuous sections in the piece. Then we get to more recent work. So we're moving chronologically through my past, and I start to use a whole bunch of, I'm just going to be very clear, I've never tried to hide this, what might be called musical tricks and gimmicks. These weird kind of like idiosyncratic things, and they're not even musical. I mean, I'm a musician, so it gets to be called music, but these are like composed theater things, really strange things, some of them involving sound. So, the use of ballpoint click pens and staplers and things like that, which make great sounds and are intended for their sounds, but they clearly have a resonance as like kind of the found object, and there's a little bit of a naive, mischievous kind of thing of importing them into the sacred space of the sanctified string quartet classical music world. So there's all these things, there's aluminum foil that's being massaged, and there's, at various points, John has to put on a green hat and then change it to a yellow hat, and that's not explained at all. And Hank has to stand up for no apparent reason and sit down, and note the time has to be recorded on a Post-it note and deposited, upstage. There's this whole, it's while the rest of the quartet is sawing away, individuals have to perform these kind of odd, absurd kinds of composed theater, and culminating in a sense in Sonny performing these hand gestures from this elaborate nonsense sign language that I've made, constructed and used in past pieces, including Darmstadt Kindergarten for Kronos. And so in a sense, we're moving forward to my slightly more recent past and my fascination with these kinds of weird absurdities and these strange surrealisms, the incongruous juxtaposition not only of sonic aural subject matter, but the incongruous juxtaposition within media. So suddenly there are these theatric things to perform, and it's suddenly where we're interested in looking at the quartet, not just hearing it. So we move forward in that regard, and then finally, that's the third of 4 sections, and finally in the 4th section, the quartet ends where 3 of them are playing this sort of like this rubbing sound that's very noisy. It's a sound that they began with, actually, so it's a return to that. But David leaves his chair, he separates himself from the quartet, and he ends by playing some of G minor sonata, solo violin sonata by Bach, BWV 1001. And so while I'm moving, in a sense, forward in my trajectory, and now I should reveal one other thing, which is that first movement, the little points in space in this laconic landscape, is actually a harmonic distillation of that Bach, which you wouldn't hear and know except if you were thinking about that, or maybe you'll metabolize it in retrospect in some way. But the crossfade, if I'm going this way, Kronos is going in another direction of sorts, which is to say that they're moving from by and by in the piece, thinking about their history, going backwards in time, all the way to David before he started Kronos, and David as a child learning this new instrument, the violin. And so basically what happens is, by and by, the sound towards the end, the amplified sound of the quartet is faded out, acknowledging the fact that they were a comparatively traditional string quartet at one point, insofar as they didn't, as I understand it, they didn't perform with amplification, and that's now a hallmark of what their presence and what they've done in many of the more recent years. So we fade that out to remind us of that earlier moment of Kronos, and then we end with the piece that I asked David, this Bach. I asked David, what was a piece that was the first piece as a child that was really, really important to you, that you really connected with as a violinist? So there's this kind of weird, maybe idiotic, probably inaudible crossfade of histories that go together in this piece. And that fascinated me sufficiently to hang other sub-musical agendas on as an overall arc formally. If I could be a role model of sorts, which is like a really haughty, arrogant way to begin a response to a question. But if I could be, it is that if I'm going to represent something, I'm trying to represent an open-mindedness that anything can happen in music, maybe that everything should happen in music, possibly, or that certainly everything could happen in music. And so like that broadness of spirit, I hope in some ways my piece embodies, and I would like to be a representative of that. I would also, paired with that, I'd like to be a skeptic of tradition and convention. We need to very strongly understand why it is that we are cherishing, reifying, simply implying the things that have already gone before. I'm not saying that all tradition is bad by any means. I rely on it, I use it, I'm enriched by it, but I would hope to sort of take a deliberate ownership of it rather than accept it out of either some sort of sacralization that's unscrutinized, or out of a poverty of imagination that we can't think of anything else to do. So in that regard, if I have a kind of a platform in this culture game of sorts, it's that my work, and I think this piece, should embody some of those ideals. I've managed to create a creative career and an artistic agenda that annexes any sort of thing that I think is interesting and radiates out from my work as a composer and limited skill in this one discipline called music. And that has afforded me the opportunity, and only out of recklessness and gumption, to do other things like make visual art. One project that was an elaborate example of this was a pictographic score that I made called The Metaphysics of Notation. It's 72 feet wide, and about a foot tall, cut into 12 6-foot wide panels. I spent about a year drawing this thing. It was really rather meticulous work. And it was shown in a museum space for a year. And only on Fridays from noon till 1 did musicians come in and interpret that visual art, that notational specification, and realize it in sound. And by the way, I gave no instructions whatsoever for how these weird glyphs and visual pictographs should be interpreted. So that was a way of saying it's a musical score. And that's what composers do. We make musical scores. But it didn't look like a regular musical score. And it was shown in a space that it saved for, that wasn't associated with music. And except for 1 hour during the week, it was not really about sound. So this was my way, in maybe a sneaky, I don't know if this is untoward, but it's just the consequence of feeling the fatigue of feeling hemmed in some ways and feeling a little bit bored with my medium, that I find myself chafing at those boundaries and pushing outward in various ways. And so in this one example, that way was to move a little bit into a territory that other people would call the visual art world. Still, I see that as the impulse of a composer searching for some creative dimension in which to move. I think that a lot of, this actually extends even further, so that I've been writing pieces that don't make sound. So this is one thing that crosses a line for many people. Like, wait a second, how is it music if it's not sound? And I understand how that's perplexing. But frankly, I'm not really interested in arguing that or trying to persuade. I'm interested in making weird, interesting things that I'm compelled by. And the question of, is this music or not, I've never found to be the relevant question. I just think the question is this interesting? And I follow my nose on that. And also, as an addendum to that, I would say that I've never found for me, and I don't know of many other people, I've not heard any stories in which the circumscription of a field, of an artistic medium, we'll call it, say, this is music, and if you cross this line, it's no longer music, it's now dance or something else. If you go this way, it's visual art. I've never found that circumscription to engender added artistic agency for the artist practitioner. These are important questions for music critics, for distributors of media content that has to be monetized and has to have channels, and your audience is no longer not your clients, your consumers need to understand how to find your product, and so we have to have marketing categories and things like that. I understand that, and I'm grateful I'm not really in that part of our cultural fabric. And for historians and musicologists, this could be a relevant question, possibly. But for the composer, I'm fine if you want to think about it, but it's really not getting me any farther towards making something, I think. Except insofar as I am clearly aware of a kind of pressure, a kind of resistance that can be interesting, maybe superficially tittillating, possibly even deep, as one medium collides with another. So I'm not unhip to the idea. I'm not unaware of the fact that people will say, wait a second, they're using aluminum foil in this piece. That seems to be marginal. That seems to be outside of the space of conventional music production, and we think of that more as an object that is in, you would expect a cook, a chef in a kitchen maybe to use it. I don't know. So I'm aware that there are these kinds of fun energies that are the result of those kinds of collisions, but it doesn't help me to say this is outside music and like stay away, stay in your lane, don't work in that manner. That's never really been helpful for me. And I should say that in looking back at these more outlandish, more marginal sort of activities that I find myself engaging as a composer, I should say that I don't pretend to have invented these impulses or this whole tradition. I am if anything, an anachronism. I'm a late-to-the-game American experimentalist. And that's just one kind of moniker. I don't even know if we need to have that. But there are all these people, John Cage and so many others, who predate me by one or more generations, who have paved the way for this kind of thought. So in some ways, you could argue that I'm a kind of reactionary throwback figure of sorts, who is in some ways rehabilitating some of the sort of surrealisms and Dadaism impulses and Fluxus impulses and other kinds of experimentalisms of the past. So I make no claim that like this is a new thing that I'm inventing, but rather I simply have my own recipe for combining the various elements, be they traditional or more recent, in my own work. First of all, I would remind them that the composer of every era, as Brian Ferneyhough tells us, be it Haydn or Xenakis, does not ask for exactitude. He or she asks for fidelity, which is really has an ethical substrate. It's about understanding the mindset of the composer, the cultural space of the composer, understanding what his or her intentions were, and then making changes, any and all changes that are in allegiance to that fidelity. So that, and coupled with that, I've thought that I should really have something, and I've actually put it in a few scores, a statement in my scores that says, the composer thanks the performer in advance for any and all changes that he or she makes that serve the purpose of making the composer seem more competent and intelligent and creative than he actually is. So in that regard, with the prerequisite of fidelity, which necessitates the contingent knowledge of who was this composer, what was, if it's me, what was his time, what was this piece about. With that kind of prerequisite sort of knowledge, I hereby deputize composers to take stewardship of an evolving artifact, not a fixed one, and to weigh in to make a kind of cultural vote on how this thing should go, how this piece should sound, how this practice should be employed. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I'd like to mention, or maybe that was two things, I don't know, I can't count. An additional thing is just to remember that for me, a successful performance, a successful piece and performance of that piece is one in which the audience says at least one thing, but preferably they follow up with the second thing. And the first thing they should say is, what the hell was that? And the second thing, if we're lucky, is, can I hear more?